Okay, and welcome back. So today we're going to talk about the Northern Renaissance, the Venetian Renaissance, and a little bit about mannerism. Let's jump right into it. So when we're talking about the Northern Renaissance, we're talking about the North countries. So this is what we call Flanders in the 16th century. Modern day, this would be Belgium and the Netherlands, but also Germany. Remember, Germany as a country and the Netherlands and Belgium as a country didn't exist in the 16th century. So we have a lot of little tiny fiefdoms and kingdoms that are all together that are kind of under the umbrella of the Holy Roman Empire in some parts, and others are independent kingdoms. Let's talk about Albrecht Dürer. Albrecht Dürer is one of the most important figures of the Northern Renaissance, principally because he was a printer as well as a painter. Started his training as a goldsmith, eventually worked his way up to becoming a painter and a printer. Now, printing technology is relatively new in the 15th and 16th century. Woodblocks had been around for a while, but not to the extent we start to see in the 16th century. A woodblock is one of the earliest forms of printing technology. You would carve a wooden block. That's why it's called woodblock or a woodcut. And you can see over here on the left the wooden block. And it has been carved into the shape, in this case a coat of arms, and then this would be inked, and then it would be pressed against paper. And then you get a reverse of the image here. You can see how the one on the right is a reverse image. Basically, anything you want to print, you leave alone. Anything you don't want to print, you carve away. And so this is a wonderful way of not just making one image, but making of multiple images. If you're making a painting, that's pretty much a one-off. You have to reinvent that every single time. But a print, you can make multiple copies of it. And this has a huge impact on society. This is the beginning of mass media, and we'll see more of why this is important when we talk about the Counter Reformation. We live in a world of mass media. We live in a world where I can take an image and I can share it on Instagram or Snapchat or any of the social media. We live in a world of instantly replicated images, and you can replicate them infinitely. That's the digital world for you. But that was not the world of the Middle Ages. If there was one work of art, there was pretty much one, and each one had to be created by hand. Now think about what the implications of what this means. If you heard about a famous work of art in some other far town, your only option for actually going to see it was to get on a horse or a cart and go there. And that means there were some things that you were just never going to see. But now you have printing, which means an artist can make a copy of it or an interpretation of it, and he can print it. And he can print not just one, not just two or a dozen, but hundreds of them potentially before the woodblock wears out, and then he can send those out. And so suddenly, instead of scarcity, where you only have one image, you have ubiquity, where the images can be represented. So if you were living in the north and you heard about Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, you didn't actually have to go to Rome to see it. You could actually just see a print of it. And now the print is an interpretation by the artist, but it's better than nothing. Remember, this is long before photographs, long before digital imagery, so that was your best option. So Albrecht Dürer's influence comes largely through his prints. I've already shown you a few prints by Albrecht Dürer because he would create prints that explained the theory of perspective. And he would send these out all over the world. People could purchase them. They're relatively affordable. This ability to replicate prints is extraordinarily important. I can't stress how important it is. Let me put it this way. I had a friend who was a graduate student at the same time I was. He had a carrel in the... A carrel is just like a little cubicle for grad students. I don't know why we call them carrels. But he had a carrel in the Reese Carpenter Library at Bryn Mawr College where he went. Yes, Bryn Mawr College is a women's college on the undergraduate level, but on the graduate level they do let men come in. And so he was a graduate student there, and in his carrel, which was kind of in a secure room, he had a print by Albrecht Dürer, an original print. Now, think about that for a minute. If you tried to buy an original painting by Albrecht Dürer, well, you pretty much have to be a billionaire, because the thing would cost you millions upon millions, if not tens of millions. But prints are so ubiquitous, you could reasonably afford them. Now, he paid a pretty penny for his, but not millions. You could buy this in the order of several thousands. And so he actually had an original Albrecht Dürer print, Some people decide to buy a boat. Some people decide to have other hobbies. His hobby was collecting historical prints. So he had a really great print collection. So it was really amazing that there's an original Albrecht Dürer hanging up in his carrel. So that means it's a lot easier to get access to these things. So you see Albrecht Dürer producing these beautiful prints. Now remember, this was originally carved in wood. So all the textures, all the lines you see here had to be carved in the negative, in reverse, in wood. So it's a technically challenging thing. And then were turned over and pressed onto the piece of paper. This one is a fascinating piece. Maybe I'll do a lecture sometime on the occult and occult imagery and alchemy imagery, because this draws on so many different images. There's the 15 square in the background. There's the Masonic devices, the carpenter's tools. All of these things have references to issues of the occult. But he would create images like these, and they could be circulated around the world, and you've probably seen them. They're really incredible. So scenes such as his Adam and Eve print as well. Many of these prints. And so this allows the experience and the expertise of the artist to spread beyond just his own little hometown. Now, he was a heck of a painter as well, and he also worked in things like watercolors and oils. He was known for his incredibly naturalistic detail. Some of his larger paintings, his more historic paintings, also carry a kind of printmaker sensibility. This is the story of Christ among the doctors. This is the story of Christ, 12 years old. He's left behind in the temple by his parents, which is evidence that Mary and Joseph must have had other children, because, you know, how would you forget a single child? But they left him behind in Jerusalem, and they're like, we left him behind. They run back to get him. When they find him, he's in the temple, and he's educating all of these skilled and learned doctors of the Jewish law. And we see here the kind of influence of this revolution in printmaking. Notice that the figures are there. Christ is, counting out on his fingers, explaining the law, and they're all holding on to books. They're holding on to books, and those books, as we can tell by looking at them, were probably meant to represent printed books. So in this early time, the printmaking and movable type had allowed for Bibles to be printed in large numbers so that people could consult them. And so this is capturing the spirit of the age. It's not just this kind of wonderful kind of little story from the New Testament. It's capturing the spirit of the age, and it's talking about how, here's Christ, who represents purity and innocence, and he has this genuine knowledge of Scripture, instructing all these men with their books. You can see there's his Albrecht Dürer's famous monogram right there, sticking out of the book as if it were a bookmark. So he's included his little monogram there, which is really fun. And you can see that the doctors of the law are portrayed in grotesque caricatures and faces that seem old. Some seem wise, some seem foolish, and he is expounding his wisdom to them. And this is a very, very different way of representing Christ and representing these characters. It shows that they were in an age of intellectual dialogue. The Reformation hasn't quite happened yet, but people are beginning to feel unsatisfied with the Catholic Church and its dogmas, and are beginning to question it. And again, this printed material, this access to printed material, is something that's really going to influence it. The North is altogether wacky. It's not like the South at all. The South is, of course, really interested in the Renaissance in Italy, reclaiming this classical past, trying to find this sense of antiquarianism, trying to recreate a specific moment in the classical past. But the North isn't like that. The North is going on its own path. In fact, it's so much a different path that people wonder if you could even talk about a Northern Renaissance at all. No example is probably better than Hieronymus Bosch. Hieronymus Bosch is something of a mysterious figure, but he was quite successful in painting altarpieces and individual commissioned works. This, by the way, is a scene from the Hell panel of his most famous triptych, and most people believe that that is a self-portrait. So that gives you a sense. We'll talk a little bit more about this. So that brings us to this, triptych. This triptych is more commonly known as the Garden of Earthly Delights, but to be honest, we have no idea what its original title, or even what its original purpose or intent was. It was probably made for a private patron somewhere in Bohemia. It's on the borders of modern-day Germany and Czechoslovakia. And it eventually found its way down into the collection of Madrid, where it was known as the strawberry painting because it had so many strawberries painted into it. But what we think we are seeing is a moment of creation. As you see the beginning of the triptych on the exterior, we see a crystalline sphere. In the crystalline sphere, we see what seems to be the world. Perhaps this is the separation of the waters from above and below the firmament. The only kind of clue as to what's going on here is a little depiction of God. But when we open this up, we are presented with a series of bizarre panels. And let's start with the left panel first, because it seems to make the most sense. The left panel is clearly a creation scene and shows Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's a fantastical landscape. And already here you can see that the North is much more into humor and visual puns. You can see that there's actually a face disguised in the scenery. We have an eye and a nose and a mouth. There's the eye, there's the mouth, there's the nose. We have these fantastic fountains. We have mountains with birds flying out of them and animals. And down at the lower half, we have a scene, and this is a particular scene in the creation of man. This is the creation of woman. And so here we have Adam being created here, and then we have Eve being introduced into the world. And so Eve, being created out of the rib of Adam, is being introduced to Adam. But already we can tell something's going wrong. We have over here a cat killing a mouse. It was the belief of the Middle Ages that in the original Garden of Eden there was no death. And so the introduction of death here is kind of foreshadowing the fall. We have bizarre and strange animals with 3 heads, things creeping up out of the deep, eating frogs, things that look like mixes between manta rays and birds, really bizarre things. So I think the implication here is pretty clear, that we have a kind of conflated narrative. God created a perfect paradise, and then, again, this is the sexist view of the early modern period, don't hold this against me, he introduces woman into the world. This causes the fall because Eve eats the apple and gets Adam to take the apple, and this introduces sin and corruption into the world. So if you read this, it looks like we have this perfect world up here, and you read it from top to bottom until you get to the bottom, you can see the corruption coming into the world. That brings us to the bizarre second panel, which has been interpreted many different ways, and which still defies accurate description. It shows a cavalcade of people in various poses, figures flying in the air, riding on bizarre animals or birds, lying in seashells, doing all kinds of things, engaging in all manner of perverse activities. And there's really no explanation for what's going on. It's quite bizarre. There you'll notice the strawberries. Strawberries are symbols of decadence. We also see owls and night jays. These are birds associated with the night, so these are things that separate darkness. Here's another owl here. Here I have one detail. Here in the detail you can see there's a unicorn kitty here. So that's bizarre. People holding fish, people engaging in all kinds of acts, eating berries of all kinds, intermingling. Here's a person rather indelicately having flowers put up their backside. And this has just been baffling. No one quite knows what to make of this scene. There's a couple of interpretations. These figures here, this thing looks like an alchemical vessel. This was the beginning of modern science and modern chemistry. Alchemy was a part of the occult and was seen as a way of getting at the stone of life, what we call the Philosopher's Stone, which is, you probably all know from the Harry Potter story. But it was meant to give life, but it was also a kind of search for wisdom and hidden knowledge. Now, alchemists could be Christians, and so this could be seen as a good thing, but they quickly gained a reputation for delving too far into things they should not. So my favorite interpretation of this scene is that this represents the fallen and decadent world just before the flood. That mankind falls from the Garden of Eden, but before the second creation, when God wipes the earth clean with the flood and saves out just Noah and his family and 2 of every living creature, you have a world in absolute decadence. So this is the world prior to the flood, and it's just insane. Incredible. And this is the final panel. This is the Hell panel. And the Hell panel shows what is coming to those who lived in that state of decadence. At the very top, we see burned out cities in flames. In the center portion, we move to a strange egg-like creature that has legs that are like trees standing on boats. There are bagpipes and musical instruments, ears pierced by arrows, strange figures in various states. If we look at individual figures, you'll notice that we see all kinds of horrors. This figure here is inside a drum, and he is being tortured by a demon who is beating on the drum. This poor person here is being sodomized by a flute while he supports a larger flute, and another person is stuck inside of it. They're being tortured by musical instruments. This poor person is being eaten by a demon that has a kettle for a hat and is the head of a nightjay, and they're being pooped out here. This person is pooping gold. This person is enraptured of themselves by another beast that has a mirror for a face. So what is going on here? These seem to be extraordinarily eclectic and wonderfully bizarre representations of specific sins: luxury, avarice, greed, pride, gluttony, lust. Certainly vanity is probably represented in the mirror. Greed and avarice is represented in the pooping out of gold. Musical instruments are often associated with sin. I myself, I don't believe in modern values like sex, drugs, and rock and rolls. I prefer old-fashioned values like wine, women, and song. So music, sex, these have always been associated with each other. And so the implication here is that when you go to hell, you will be tortured with devices that led you down the wayward path into sin. These are just wonderfully, we love them for their just comic complexity in the series of tortures that exist. I love that you have this person being assaulted by a pig, and the pig is wearing the habit of a nun. So everything comes in. This person over here is being crucified on a harp or a lyre. Really kind of amazing stuff. Really wonderful. I wish you could get into it, but you just can't. So again, I want to stress this shows just how different the North really is. There's nothing remotely classical about this. There's nothing trying to revitalize a great classical past from either the Greek or Roman empires. Some of it could be said to be very naturalistic. Others is, of course, as unnaturalistic as you can possibly get, to the invention of bizarre animals and creatures and demons and devices to torture people with and pierce them and destroy them. Really kind of horrible, fun stuff. And that's something that I think is different about the North, is the North goes for the jugular. The North wants to take you directly to this kind of emotional, visceral place, and it's much more concerned with symbolism and narrative and kind of melodramatic presentation than it is with classicism and revitalizing naturalism. You can see that also in the works of Grünewald. Grünewald was a German artist who also was noted for his altarpieces. One of his most famous altarpiece is going to be this, the Isenheim altarpiece. The Isenheim altarpiece is a series of multiple panels. So it's again what we would call a polyptych. It has many different panels. It starts on the outer side, and it shows us an absolutely grotesque version of the crucifixion. Now think about Michelangelo and think about how he turned the death of Christ into a heroic movement, into a heroic moment where Christ is represented more like a Greek god. Think about that and then compare it to this. Here we have the scene that comes from the New Testament. We have John and Mary over here. We have John the Baptist, who has the Lamb of God beside him, and he points to the body of Christ. But you couldn't have a more tortured figure of Christ if you tried. His hands are twisted upward in an unnatural position. His body is racked and emaciated. Elsewhere, we see his body in the deposition below, and you can see all the wounds on his body. Again, not something that we would regard as classical, more dramatic and symbolic. You open this up to reveal the next scene, and in the next scene we have a completely different set of images. So in this scene we have the crucifixion, and we also have saints like Saint Anthony, and in this case Saint Sebastian, who's pierced with an arrow. The emphasis of the exterior seems to be the mortal realm, suffering, pain, penance, grief. But when you open it up, it is completely transformed to hope. We have on one side the Annunciation promising the coming of Christ. We have the Nativity showing his arrival into this world. And then over here we have the resurrection. So the resurrection is the immediate fulfillment of the crucifixion. And wow, he pops onto the scene. He's glowing. His skin is white. The drapery is just flowing all around him. The soldiers aren't merely asleep, they're knocked back by his glory. So this melodramatic display is in a direct, kind of counterpoint or antithesis to the horror of his death. All of this ultimately culminates with this opening up with a scene showing the presence of God, a kind of deicist scene where we are in the presence of God and we access God. So there's this mystical kind of movement through life, and that's what this altarpiece is supposed to do. It's supposed to move you through a spiritual plane to get closer to God. And it shows you this. I mean, here we have again the temptation of St. Anthony, where he's tortured by all these horrible monstrosities, and we see people on their way through life to this kind of revelatory mystic moment. So this is much more of a visionary aspect in art. Instead of looking at these beautiful classical statues and what they represent, you're supposed to get this almost kind of visceral, mystical passage as you go through it. It's really an amazing piece. Okay, and that brings us to Peter Bruegel, the elder. Bruegel is a Flemish painter from the Netherlands. And he's a genre painter. That's what makes him different. Again, he's another one of these demonstrations of why the North is so different. Now, what do I mean by a genre painter? What I mean is a painter, he paints scenes of everyday life, or he also paints scenes of proverbs and morality tales. And to explain this, I have to explain that painting exists in kind of tiers. At the top tier of painting in subject matters is what we call history painting. History painting is paintings of classical myths, classical or ancient history, but it also could be Judeo-Christian history, so Christian stories. So something like this, The Tower of Babel by Bruegel, is a history painting. And he did plenty of that, paintings of those types. But what's interesting in the North is that unlike the South, you can also paint scenes of everyday life. And this is a much lower tier of painting. Genre painting is generally considered as to be one of the lowest or basest tiers of painting. Generally it goes from like history painting to portrait painting of important people, and then, genre painting is underneath that. But what's interesting is that while history painting is very prestigious in the South, and genre painting is pretty much not prestigious, in the North they do a lot of genre painting. They're okay with it. And the paintings are often smaller. They're obviously made for a more intimate experience in a home, a domestic environment, instead of these big, huge commissions that are meant for churches or palaces or things like that. So yeah, Bruegel will do stuff like history paintings such as this, but he'll also do stuff like this. This is a kermesse, or a peasant dance. And when people ask me, what is this about? It's about a peasant dance. That's what it is. It's a slice of life. That's what we mean by genre. It's everyday life. And that's the thing that really sets the North apart. We'll see this a lot in the 17th century. When we get to the golden age of Dutch art of the 17th century, Dutch Baroque art, we'll see a lot of everyday scenes, a lot of slice of life, ordinary interior domestic scenes. But we see people behaving as they would at a peasant dance, dancing, drinking, playing the bagpipes. Interesting enough, we associate bagpipes with Scotland. The reality is that bagpipes were actually invented in the Netherlands and were imported over to Scotland, and the Scottish have never caught on to the joke. But anyhow, we can see this likewise in other things like Hunters in the Snow. Think about this for a minute. There's no classical reference here. This isn't any great classical or historical moment or story. It's not even a historical moment from the time period. It is just everyday life. So we see hunters, but we also see people skating on the ice. Remember, Netherlands is a very cold country, so the canals and the lakes freeze over. And we get this sense of landscape. Landscape is another genre that wasn't considered to be a very prestigious genre in the South. You could put a landscape into something, but it better support a history painting if you were going to do that. But in the North, nope, you could get away with it. You could get away with landscape painting. And we have these deep and beautiful landscapes with all of these telling details of everyday life. The other thing that Bruegel is known for is he would paint these parables. This is a parable that, of course, comes out of the New Testament, the blind leading the blind. And so you can't have the blind leading the blind, else they tumble into the ditch. And so here he depicts that literally by having these blind individuals pulling each other along until the first one falls into the ditch, and they all follow after him. This, of course, is a moral example of how, to behave. You have to have somebody who actually knows what they're doing, or you're going to get lost. Again, we have elements. These are people in contemporary dress. I love the landscape and the church in the background. That gives this incredible sense of depth. Here's one of my all-time favorites, though. This is Netherlandish proverbs. And again, this has the frenetic energy of Bosch with all of this action going on, all of this craziness going on. And the Dutch are a very humorous people. They love, kind of aphorisms and maxims and turns of phrase that are meant to indicate certain attributes. All cultures do this, but the Dutch have a special genius for it. And so he decided to include all of these together. And so if you want to think about this, this is kind of a Where's Waldo of Proverbs, that the person who's looking at this is supposed to look at this painting on two levels. On one level, you are supposed to see the kind of madcap merriment of it all this kind of action going on, everything going everywhere, and just kind of get an enjoyment for the crazy scene. But then as you lean in, get a little closer, you're supposed to pick out particular scenes and say, oh, I get it. That's what it is. These all end up being visual puns based on old-fashioned proverbs that anyone painting at that time would have known. So we're going to take a look at just a few of these because, oh my gosh, we could spend a whole lecture just on this. But I want to take a look at this scene here, this scene back here, this strange scene of tarts on a roof, and then also this figure here. Some of these proverbs are pretty obvious, like this guy is literally ramming his head into a brick wall. How many times have you ever said that? I'm beating my head against a brick wall. So this is, again, a proverb for obstinacy, someone being stubborn or unreasonable when they just can't get to success. There's several proverbs in this scene. Notice that he's got one shoe on and one shoe off. That was a common proverb for somebody who's just wildly unprepared for the day and unprepared for life. Some of these are a bit funner. Here's a guy pressing his backside, his exposed buttocks to the door. I don't recommend you do this, but you can clearly read that this is the insult, that you're rubbing your backside on the door to kind of insult them. The tarts on the roof is a little harder to figure out. That's not something we would know. Some of these proverbs are idiomatic, meaning that they would only be known in the vernacular culture at the time. They only would have been popular at the time, whereas in our day and age, they just have no idea what these means. Well, this is a roof tiled with tarts. What on earth does that mean? Well, tarts are not very practical to put on your roof. Tarts are also desserts. They're pastries. They would have been expensive. They would have been a luxury. So this is actually a proverb that means if a person has a roof tiled with tarts, it's like somebody saying he's got, the streets are paved with gold. It's ridiculous levels of luxury. It's an insane luxury to tile your roof with tarts. So it's a way of saying this person is insanely rich or insanely prosperous. Some of them are actually quite sexual in orientation. So this is a woman cloaking her husband. Notice that she has this very red dress on. Red is, again, a very symbolic color. And she has a very low-cut dress. And her husband is very old while she is very young. So the idea is that she's cloaking him. She's, putting a cloak over him. She's deceiving him when in fact she is out about and carousing around the town. So the North is very, very different It doesn't concern itself so much with this naturalism or with believable perspective or with classical historicism. It's much more concerned with narrative, symbolism, genre, everyday life. It's really quite different. And then we get to the Venetian Renaissance, and the Venetian Renaissance is different again. So again, we're going to circle in. We're talking about this region here at the very north of the Adriatic in Italy. So going back to our map of Italy, just to orient you, if Rome is right here, we're talking about this region here. And this is the Veneto. And the Veneto is basically Venice and the environs in and around Venice. So we zoom in up on it. Here you can see this is the Veneto. And this section here is the lagoon of Venice. Venice is this island right here. If we zoom in a little bit, you can see it. There you can see it with the canal. There you can see the Grand Canal. And Venice, as well as the lagoon, is a whole series of inhabited islands. Now, Venice as a city is an interesting place. Usually when you go there and you see pictures of it, often it's flooded. You hear a lot about global warming and the destruction of Venice, but the truth is it's always had a problem with flooding. The entire city was built out on the middle of some very marshy land in the middle of a swamp, and that was intentional. In the 10th century, there were lots of invaders coming into the region, and so they wanted a place that was naturally defensible. So pretty bad invaders if you've got to go move out into the middle of a swamp. But they didn't leave it a swamp. They drained parts of it, packed wooden pilings into the marsh so they could build an entire city on it. And they actually rerouted the river to make the lagoon. So we think of the lagoon as this natural environment, but it's not. It's actually entirely man-made. Now, global warming is, of course, threatening it, and they may have to permanently dike off the lagoon. Right now, the lagoon is attached to the sea, so it's subject to the tides, and it often comes in and floods the beautiful St. Mark's Square and St. Mark's Church. But maybe they can manage it some way. I know that they're working on a massive technology project. Now, building out on the lagoon may not have seemed like the smartest thing in the world, but it actually was pretty brilliant because it meant that the city was extremely well defended. Plus, you had access to the sea, and if you have access to the sea, you have access to trade. And so Venice became a real center, a magnet of trade, commerce, wealth, and wherever the money is, that's where the art goes. Now, today, it still does some sea trading, but mostly it's a legacy city. All of the beautiful art, all of the beautiful riches that come out of Venice came because of this unique position that it had at the top of the Adriatic, being at the end of a long chain of trading networks. All of this wealth, of course, then feeds into a kind of revolution in the arts. Now remember, Venice, by trade, is connected to Ghent and Antwerp, and these are centers in the north where we have the innovation of oil painting. So it's not a surprise that oil painting gets a much-needed head start in Venice as opposed to other places for the Renaissance. And so we see a string of painters, particularly in the end of the Quattrocento, particularly the Bellini family. You have Jacopo Bellini, who is a very successful painter, and he trains his sons, and one of those sons is Giovanni Bellini. And Giovanni Bellini becomes kind of the first master out of the Venetian Renaissance. And you can actually see a shift during his lifetime as to what happens in the Venetian Renaissance. When you look at his earlier works, they look terribly flat. This is the Agony in the Garden. This is the scene where Bellini depicts Christ praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is where he sweats, as it were, drops of blood, and goes through this agony. But you can see that the background looks not particularly deep. It looks kind of flat. The figures don't seem terribly rooted. But as we go on, he is interchanging with ideas from the north, and he is also expanding into oil painting, and his stuff gets a lot more textually rich. You see this, for example, the story of St. Francis in ecstasy. St. Francis receives the stigmata, the wounds in the hands and the feet and in the side that indicate that he has been blessed with the same marks, the same wounds as Christ endured. And so here you see him in ecstasy. Notice how well-rooted he is to the ground with the shadows. Notice how deep that background is, how much better the perspective is. And it just continues. And we start to see the kind of tonalism, the sfumato, as you were, that was pioneered by Da Vinci and others inspiring him. We get a much more accurate kind of sense of perspective, a much more accurate sense of atmospheric perspective in the background. Richer, more fuller characters, richer, more fuller glazing in the figures. And we can see that he is being influenced as he is coming under the influence of another painter, Giorgione. So Giorgione is the person who probably pioneered this advent of tonalism in the Venetian Renaissance. We often think of him as the founder of the Venetian Renaissance. Bellini is that kind of transition from the Quattrocento into the High Renaissance, but Giorgione is the person who gives it full flower and development. And so you see these wonderful tones and gradations of tones produced in his works. He ends up being the teacher of Titian, and so that's why he is significant in that regard. Doesn't live very long. I think he's like just, in his 30s when he's killed off by, I hate to say this, the plague. We sometimes forget that, we live in the modern age where we think pandemics are like this rare thing, but a plague came along every 20, 30 years practically in the ancient world. And so it cut Giorgione down. Giorgione, we don't know much about his early life. His name here just means Big George, so he's obviously a big guy. And he also is one of these pioneers for bringing back the great classical nude. This is the Sleeping Venus, sometimes called the Dresden Venus, because it's in Dresden. And here we have, again, that wonderful gradation of the skin tones, this tonalism, these wonderful glazes, especially you see it in the fabric, the drapery, and in the flesh, how you create this beautiful figure. But then we also have this very deep landscape and wonderful depiction of a landscape. But notice the landscape does not look classical. The landscape actually looks pretty contemporary. And here's where we get into the question of what is this figure supposed to represent? Again, Venus is one of the few figures in classical mythology that was shown nude, and this is a gesture, especially the gesture where she covers her genitalia. That's a gesture that we associate with the Capitoline Venus. So that's evidence that, okay, she's Venus enough, we'll call her Venus. But it's always important to know that many times the artists are not the ones naming these paintings. These are names attached to these paintings after the fact by nerds like me, art historians. And sometimes these names are attached because we want to gloss the fact over that he was painting naughty pictures for his patron. It's hard to understand how a picture like this was accepted. It was almost certainly scandalous in its time. And we're seeing something that's even a little different than the Botticelli. The Botticelli seems to be making a humanistic argument. It seems to be reinterpreting classical mythology for the sake of telling some kind of story, perhaps Christian or derived. But what's the story here? And with the contemporary background, how are we supposed to understand her as a classical figure? Again, there's a lot of pretense in art. I hope you realize that. There's a lot of pretense in art, and it's not just today. People talk about pretense in contemporary art, but man, it goes all the way back. Again, we have to assume, I think this was probably made for a private patron. When we see Giorgione's works, he does kind of give you this incredibly rich surfaces, rich figures, and pushes it back. I love this one. It sees the Tempest, where we have what appears to be a shepherd and a woman nursing a child in the foreground, but we have this bolt of lightning in the back, and every level of this is rewarding. Notice we have classical antiquity, ruins, columns, but we also have contemporary life. How are we supposed to interpret these mixtures of contemporary and classical themes? It's really interesting. We'll see that same kind of duality and ambiguity in the works of Titian. So Titian was a student of first Bellini and Giorgione, and he's probably the preeminent painter of the Venetian Renaissance. He really makes his reputation as a portraitist, and he paints the most powerful people in the world. This is a portrait of Charles V. Charles V was the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor simultaneously, which means he had dominion over most of Europe and all of the New World territories that had been brought in by the conquests of Cortez and Pizarro. So probably there's few people in the world that controlled as much territory as Charles V. And here Charles V is painted, again, all of this wonderful mass and figures, has incredible form, but with these deep backgrounds that he probably owes to his master Giorgione. But it's not just that. One of the things that Titian is most noted for is he's probably one of the first painters, and this is something the Venetian Renaissance is really known for allowing the brushwork of his paintings to be registered, to be on the surface. If you look and think back to some of these earlier painters, they were using thin glazes, and you almost can't see the brushwork. You almost have to get up and put your nose right on the painting to see the brush strokes at all. By the way, if you do put your nose on the painting, they will kick you out, so don't do that. But if you look at this example, this wonderful portrait of the Duke of Urbino, look at this armor. Look at the red velvet hanging and drapery in the background. If you look at certain details, for example, say the shine and the gleam on his armor, the brushstrokes here, or this brushstroke here in the background, you can actually see the brushstrokes, even in a reproduction like this. He doesn't disguise the brushstrokes. He allows the surface to be what it is. I'm a firm believer that, if you're going to paint a painting, it should look like a painting. Photorealism is dazzling, I love it, but after a while it leaves me cold, because you're actually removing a level of expression of the artist. And one of the levels of expression of the artist is the brushstroke. So, you have only so many tools as a painter, so why would you give one up? And that's what's really cool here, is that he realizes you can do more with less. You don't need to noodle out every detail. And so a Titian is painted in a much different way than even a Giorgione. It isn't painted in as many thin layers. It's more what we call alla prima. Alla prima means all at once, although that's a term that's not pioneered until later. He's not painting in so many layers. He's painting the freshness of the paint. He's allowing the squiggle of a brushstroke to appear, and it gives it another level of vitality. What's really astonishing is to get into this armor. I've seen this piece in person. I've spent many hours in front of it, actually, because it's one of my favorite paintings, is how little paint there actually is. That a lot of this is just black, and he's just painted in little highlights, and this is enough to trick your eye that you're looking at this deeply reflective surface. Reflective surfaces are incredibly hard to paint. So this painterly technique, so what we call it when you leave the brushworks visible, is a major hallmark of Titian. Titian also goes and makes his reputation, instead of not just painting portraits, but in painting classical themes. This one is one of his earlier ones. This is Sacred and Profane Love, which has been one of the more difficult paintings to interpret. This one he's, again, relying very heavily on Giorgione. You have these deep, beautiful backgrounds. The surfaces are a little bit more polished and finished here, much like Giorgione's surfaces. But we have two figures, and they are titled Sacred and Profane Love. Again, that may not have been the title he gave it. This is a title later curators and people give to it, and collectors give to it. But the traditional understanding is that this, the naked lady, is sacred love, and this is profane love. That's a really kind of strange thing. You would think that the nude person would be the profane, that is the not sacred love, and the person who is here dressed fully in compliance with BYU dress standards is the person who would be the sacred love. But it's actually the reverse. That's something that is really fascinating. When you have to think about the Renaissance or other times, you have to realize you're not thinking the way they think. They think in different ways. So how would they have thought? Well, in this case, this figure holds a lamp, and lamps are usually symbols of enlightenment. This could be an incense burner as well. That's usually associated with church. And so she is exposed and naked, beautiful, billowing drapery, but that means that she is without adornment. She is pure. Whereas over here we have a person who is dressed perhaps like a bride, but in luxurious silks. And it's the luxury, it's the wealth that indicates this is profane love. The figure between them appears to be Eros, or Cupid, as kind of agent of love. So how are we supposed to interpret this? And we're not entirely certain. You can see that you do have strong classical references. Here we have what appears to be a late Roman sarcophagus that has been repurposed as a kind of water trough. Is this two features of the same idea, two aspects of love, or do we have a representation of a goddess or a person to be? It's really, really hard to get a sense of. And it gets even harder when we get to this painting. This is the Venus of Urbino. This is probably the most famous painting that Titian ever did, but it's also a completely enigmatic painting. So in one level, okay, it's a fabulous nude. It's a fabulous nude, much like Giorgione's Sleeping Venus, but unlike the Sleeping Venus, this Venus is awake. And even more interesting is she is looking at you. You are the focus of her attention. So we often talk about the male gaze in art, and clearly the male gaze is in effect here, that we have a figure that is being displayed for the male gaze. We have to understand this is probably made for a male patron, so fabulous nude. Again, a lot of pretense in art history. Maybe this is Venus, but you can't see the air quotes I'm making with my fingers, but this is not actually Venus. It's just a fabulous nude, and we use the pretense of Venus to show it off. But what's really interesting is we have a sense of the female gaze. She looks back at you. She fingers the flowers here. She has a band on her wrist that is associated with the goddess Venus, but also associated with prostitutes, courtesans, people, sex workers, I think we would say in our day and age. Sex worker is so much less sexy than courtesan. Courtesan is a so much better way to say sex worker, but that's what's going on. So at one level, it just seems to be a pretense to show a fabulous nude. But I always like to say this, I always like to remind people, remember, there's no such thing as photobombing in a painting. If a figure is in there, it's because the painter wants it in there. And immediately you should take a look at this thing and say, why on earth is that little dog there? Let's start with the little dog. Little dogs are, of course, emblems of loyalty. Lap dogs sit on your lap. That's where you keep your naughty bits. And so they're usually signs of sexual fidelity and sexual loyalty. And like, okay, what's going on there? But there's actually something else that's happening here. And of course, these figures here, these maids in the background. I love the composition of this thing because you can see that she has hangings, she has curtains. And the artist has, not so subtly, used the curtain to draw a line directly to the naughty bits, so you can't mistake what's going on here. And the maids here are gathering up the rest of the curtains. Now, again, if you've never been to Venice or the region of the Veneto, it's kind of cold. I remember I went there and all the postcards had rainy scenes. Boy, if you can't find a sunny day to take a postcard of, it's got to be cold. It's got to be that way. So they would put hangings around beds to keep them warm through the night. And so they are getting out the bed hangings, presumably, to hang her up and prepare her for the evening. And they're actually reaching into what's known as a cassone. A cassone is just literally a big box, a big chest. And this is the thing that's probably the clue to help us understand what's going on in this painting. Because there is a tradition of cassones in this part of the world, and cassones are dowry chests. So you get married as a woman, particularly if you're a noblewoman, you come into the house with your dowry. Your dowry would include all your linens, your personal items that you would bring into the household, and you would also get a chest to hold all of this in. These chests would be fabulously decorated because, hey, you're a rich, spoiled snot, why not? You might as well bling it out in style. But one of the things that's really curious is on the inside of these chests, it was a very common feature to paint a reclining Venus. And you see that in these chests all this time. So this is a marriage chest, and you have to ask yourself, okay, this is a marriage chest intended to hold the personal effects of a bride, and she goes into a household. So this is a box that primarily she is the only one looking at, she and her handmaidens. You crack open this lid, and it has a picture of a naked woman. But because of its context, it's a picture of a naked woman meant for a naked woman. So, I mean, meant for a married woman. So what's going on? Why would you do this? Why would you paint a picture of Venus on the inside of these lids? It's not meant to be on public display. It's meant to be just something that's seen privately. Well, again, you see this kind of humanistic idea. Venus ceases to be an actual goddess by this time, and she becomes a metaphor for love, for fecundity, for fertility. There's lots of things you can say about Venus. You can call her a hoe, but she definitely was fertile, and she definitely, had a lot of children. So there are expectations in families, just like there are. I don't have any married children yet, but when I do get married, I am sure I will be just like every other father-in-law and pester the snot out of them for grandchildren. And those were the expectations in noble families. And of course, this is very important because you got to have kids to keep the family line going. And that's the whole point. So this seems to be, quite frankly, a little bit, more than a little bit sexist, a kind of sexist message towards women in these households, that you are to be as Venus to your husband. You are supposed to get busy, start having kids, be productive. And so it's this kind of message. So let's go back, and this was a popular kind of folk art, if you will, that existed at the time. So let's go back to the Venus of Urbino and try to make sense of what we're seeing here. When you put all this together, the dog, the cassones, the nude figure here, this seems to be an extrapolation of this tradition of these Venus paintings inside of this. We are supposed to imagine this as a woman on her wedding night. Not interesting. Excuse me. She represents a woman on her wedding night. And so there's so many layers to this. She is to be Venus to her husband. That is, she is supposed to give him connubial bliss, but she is also to provide him with an heir. So all these expectations building into this. And that asks the question, well, if this is a woman on her wedding night, where is the husband? And this is where this thing gets absolute voyeuristic, because by her looking at us, by us being on this side of the bed, indicates this was almost certainly meant for a male audience, perhaps a noble or a lord, we don't exactly know. But in this case, it would have been this kind of wonderful, kind of voyeuristic image. And so you get an image of Venus as if she is lying on the marriage bed. She represents Venus, but she also represents a kind of ideal woman. It's really kind of complex and nuanced. And, you know, I gotta be honest about this. It's also meant to be deliberately erotic. We sometimes, again, a lot of art history is based on pretense, get pretty precious about these and say, oh, the beautiful classical nude, and we describe it in only formalist terms, but it clearly is meant to be erotic in that way. So these images are incredibly layered. You can't get away from how layered they are. There's so much culture unpacked in these things. And that's going to get me to my next image. So one of the people that was most inspired by Titian is going to be Veronese. He comes from Verona, but he's active predominantly in Venice. He paints a whole series of paintings, large history paintings. The most famous is probably The Wedding at Cana. But he gets a commission to paint this painting. We call this painting The Feast in the House of Levi. But it was actually not intended to be that scene. The Feast in the House of Levi is this presumably minor kind of event in the New Testament where Levi comes and invites Christ into his house, etc., and Christ is there. But in its original incarnation as he painted it, it was intended to be a scene of the Last Supper. So here we see Christ, and in the center, there's Peter. Hopefully you can recognize Peter. Go Broncos. There he is in blue and orange, short hair and beard. And so he is gathered there, and then we have what is presumably John, and then we have the figure turning away, which would be, Judas in this case. And so we have a scene of the Last Supper, but the scene is just bizarre, because there's more going on. We have men in turbans. Now remember, this is the 16th century. The Ottoman Empire is still very much alive and is an enemy of the Venetian state. They go to war against each other all the time. In fact, they just fought a major battle, the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. So you have individuals of many different races and origins. Now, we love diversity, we love inclusion, but not back then. Back then, that would have been seen as bizarre. especially as you get into the details of it. You have a dog, you have a cat under the table, you have a little Moorish boy fighting with a dwarf who is clearly there as a kind of entertainer, as a gesture. And then even more bizarrely, we have mercenaries and soldiers, and the mercenaries are dressed in dress that identifies them as Swiss mercenaries. Why is that significant? We'll come to that in a minute. So you can imagine when this was first painted, it caused a bit of a scandal, and actually brought him to the attention of a new organization that we'll talk about in a minute, of the Catholic Church. This was seen as blasphemous, to take something as sacred as the Last Supper and the life of Christ, and to put all these troubadours and minstrels and mercenaries and foreigners into it. You can see why this could have been seen as troubling. To entirely explain why, we got to talk about this guy. And we got to talk about a thing known as the Counter Reformation. So long story short, hopefully you've heard about Martin Luther. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk in the Catholic Church, and he began to have severe disagreements with the Catholic Church over things like indulgences. Now, you've often heard that indulgences were selling sin, so that you could sin and indulge yourself. That's not quite technically right, but let's just gloss over that because the theological differences are too complex to get into. But there was a series of practices in the Catholic Church that many people, including many Catholics, saw as corrupt. And according to legend, on October 31st, yes, Halloween, which is also known as Reformation Day, if you're a Lutheran, I know Lutherans had celebrated it, at the Church of Wittenberg in 1517, he nailed up his 95 theses. Now, these 95 theses were 95 statements proclaiming things that he saw wrong in the Catholic Church. And he nailed it up to the door of the church because the door of the church was like the bulletin board for the church at those days. So now it's like we use Facebook to communicate or whatever. But if you needed to communicate something to the whole church, you would put it up there. And the next day is All Saints' Day. And so he knew people would be coming for the feast day. So he did it on that day so everybody would see it. Well, this is the start of what becomes the Protestant Reformation. And the Protestant Reformation causes this massive schism in the church between the Catholics and the Protestants. And every possible question of the Catholic faith is questioned. Does the Pope have authority or not? How do you get to God? How are you saved? Are you saved by grace? Are you saved by works? Are there other means to authority outside of Scripture, or is it only Scripture? And these debates raged for the next, 3 centuries, to be perfectly honest, and they're still not done arguing about it today, to be perfectly honest. So this caused a response in the church. For his part, Martin Luther is hauled in front of an imperial diet. An imperial diet is just a diet is a council. That's what it means. Not like, I mean, he looks kind of chubby. He could stand to shed a few pounds, but that's not what we mean by diet. He was hauled in front of those. He actually defended himself against Johann X, and they accused him of all this manner of blasphemy. But at the end of the day, he gives the ultimate statement. And he says that he had to stand on the side of the freedom of conscience, that he read the Scriptures, and in his opinion, the Catholic Church no longer abided by the Scriptures. And he said, I can stand here. It's all I can do. I can do no other. And he made a real impassioned defense for the freedom of consciousness, the freedom of conscience, the ability to decide for yourself what God wanted you to do. And this sparks off this massive revolution. Now, the Catholic Church, for its part, did not just sit around and say, well, okay. It actually saw this as an enormous threat. And this all comes to a head at the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent is a council organized by the Catholic Church, by the Vatican, to basically push back against this onslaught that was coming from the Protestant world. And the onslaught is real. Remember how we talked about printing introduces the age of mass media? Boy, did it ever. And the Protestants are probably the first to make extensive use of the new medium of printing. And so in the 16th century, there are all these pamphlets or flyers or broadsheets that are printed criticizing the Catholic Church. Here, for example, you have these wonderful prints. Let's start with the one on the right. The one on the right shows the Pope seated on a throne, attended to by demons, and his entire throne is inside the mouth of hell. Subtle. Subtle. This one over here is just as good. Here we have a demon, again, representing hell. He has this tree growing out of his back that holds a pot, and the heat coming off his head of all these evil ideas is stewing the pot. The Pope is being carried by a demon into the mouth of hell, and you can see there, drinking beers and partying. Right in the mouth of hell is a nun and a priest and a monk. Again, really awful stuff. So not subtle stuff. This is the new Protestants who are breaking away, saying the Catholic Church is run by the devil. And it doesn't even, it gets even better. Now, this one I've seen alternately identified as the devil playing Martin Luther's head like a bagpipe, but I've also heard that it's not Martin Luther, it's actually meant to represent an Augustinian monk. So it might represent the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church and the organs of the Catholic Church, they're being played like a bagpipe by the devil. And of course you have to love the devil. Is this wonderful face, and he has a mouth coming out of his genitals. It's just fantastic. Here's another one. I wish I could find a better picture of this, but this shows the devil and his demons up here sitting on a commode, and they are literally crapping out priests and nuns. Okay. So you can imagine this pissed the Catholic Church off. And so the Catholic Church decided in the Council of Trent that it had to respond, and respond it did. Which brings us to, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Had to get a Monty Python reference in there. Now, I have to frame things as correctly. This response to Protestantism happened in many ways. We generally, in America, have a very positive view of the Protestant Reformation. If you're taught about the Protestant Reformation at all in America, you're taught that, there was this big, evil, corrupt Catholic Church. The Protestants came along, they reformed it. Then the Pilgrims wanted freedom, so they came to America, and yay, America! And then we had Walmart and, 64-ounce big gulps, and everything was great. And that's not actually the way it happened. The truth is that the Protestants were just crazy in the beginning. I'm not saying Protestants today. I'm saying that in the beginning, the Protestants were really violent. And in fact, you actually have this wonderful thing called the Bildensturm. The Bildensturm means the storm of images, or against images, is the iconoclasm. And one of the things the Protestants did is they not only wanted to get rid of the Pope, but they wanted to get rid of everything associated with the Catholic Church. And one of the things that was most associated with the Catholic Church was, in fact, the use of images and the cults of saints. So here you can see in this print the destruction of Our Lady in Antwerp, Catholic Church, where they smashed the stained glass windows, they broke the statues, they tore down the tapestries, they whitewashed the walls. And this happened all over Europe. You had radical Protestants destroying art. England, most of the churches and ruins of churches and abbeys in England happened during this time. England was really known for these beautiful oak Gothic period carvings, and very few of those have survived because Protestants went into the churches, dragged the wooden carvings out of the church, and dragged them out into the open square and set them on fire. So it was a very, very violent time. And in fact, the Protestant Reformation unleashed more than 200 years of violent terror. The worst part of this would have to be the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. The 30 Years' War killed more people in Eastern Europe than the Black Plague did in the 14th century. That's just shocking. So this interreligious conflict was a big deal. It was not a minor thing. And the Catholics had to decide, how do we respond to this? And so what's interesting is their response was pretty nuanced. It wasn't just like, all Protestants are bad, kill all Protestants. Well, there were some Catholics who felt that way. Let's be honest. It was a pretty violent era. But many of the Catholics agreed with many of the 95 theses that Martin Luther did put down into writing, and decided, hey, we got to fix some of this. And so they embraced some of the reforms of the Protestants, But in other ways, they said, no, the Protestants have gone too far. And one of the ways they went too far was in this iconoclasm, this destruction of images. So we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to have images. And Catholics were like, no, images are part of the way that we communicate with God. Images are part of the way we demonstrate that the Spirit of God is with us. Saints were seen as kind of receptacles of the Spirit of God. And so saints and their relics and the images associated with those saints and their relics in churches were part of Catholic practice. And so they say, nope, we're going to double down on images. And this becomes the Counter Reformation. So in other words, the Catholics said, okay, in some ways we'll fix things that the Protestant wants us to fix, but in other ways, nope, we're going to Catholic harder. And they did. And in the 16th and 17th century, more saints are declared than had been declared in the previous 1500 years of Christianity. It's amazing. And so there is a huge explosion of not just saints and relics of saints and of miracles and of visions, but also of art of every kind. But they're very nervous about this art. Is this art actually expressing a Catholic dogma, or is it not? Is it actually trying to let in some of this heretical Protestant thought? So that's what eventually gets us to the Spanish Inquisition. Now, I use this slide to be funny, but the Spanish Inquisition isn't yet. The Spanish Inquisition is a later time period. But yes, we do have the Committee for the Doctrine of the Faithful, which is formed to investigate artists, to make sure that they are towing the line. So let's get back to Veronese. So Veronese's painting doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in this context. And so perhaps now you can appreciate why Catholic scholars and Catholic officials got very, very nervous about this painting. Particularly because the Swiss soldiers would have been seen as Protestant soldiers. So you can see that all of these things being included in there would have made them very nervous. And everywhere they looked at this painting, they saw evidence of blasphemy or evidence of Protestant doctrine. For his part, Veronese denied it all. He was kind of hauled in front of these church officials, and he denied it all. And when they asked him, they said, so why are these troubadours, these foreigners, these entertainers, why are they there? He said, well, you know, this was the house of Joseph of Arimathea. He would have been a wealthy man, and so he would have had entertainers, he would have had troubadours, he would have had mercenaries and guards in the house like any wealthy noble would have had, so why shouldn't they be in there? Eventually the Catholic Church bought that enough that they decided that they couldn't condemn the painting, but they thought that the painting was too outrageous to be called the Last Supper, so they settled on a compromise, the compromise being, we'll call it the Feast in the House of Levi. Then it just becomes a scene out of the life of Christ and not the Last Supper, which was considered too sacred for this kind of wild juxtaposition. So what was Veronese actually trying to do? Was he actually kind of a secret Protestant and was trying to sneak in pro-Protestant in there? Well, I don't know, because while he may have had Protestant sympathies, I seriously doubt he had any Ottoman sympathies, and so he slips a few turbaned Ottomans in there as well. So that's a little far afield. I think what's going on here is an influence from the North, but it's entirely within the realm of iconography. Remember what I said about the North? The North is more interested in stories. The North is more interested in parables. Let me give you an example. Look at this beautiful thing. Okay, so this, I mean, right when you look at it, ignore the title for the moment, but take a look at this. This is Peter Artson. He's this Netherlandish painter, and right away you see this beautiful, sumptuous, well, at least I think it's sumptuous. Maybe you're a vegan and you're not a carnivore like me, but I'm a major carnivore. And so you see all of this beautiful, sumptuous meat. You see gravies, you see sausages, you see whole hocks of ham and pig's heads and cow's heads and racks of lamb and grouse and all kinds of things. And that's what first gains your attention. But if you look really closely into the background, there's Jesus and Mary on the back of a donkey being led by Joseph. I know you almost can't see it, it's so small. And what is she doing? She is giving food to someone who is begging. So this entire scene is, again, it's like another one of those Where's Waldo of art. What you're looking at here is a scene that's a gotcha scene. The artist is playing a trick on you. You are looking at all these wonderful and sumptuous meats and things to eat. You're thinking about the plenty. Perhaps you're salivating like Pavlov's dog at the thought of eating. And instead, the artist hides the true moral in the background, where you could easily miss it, and shows that, a true Christian would act as Mary and Jesus does and would give, would not be thinking about their own appetites, but would be thinking about other people's wants. And so it's a wonderful way to kind of show a message. It tells a story. It's a religious scene. It is definitely the flight into Egypt, the scene that comes out of the life of Mary and the infant Jesus, but it tells it in this moralizing way, and it's kind of couched in this elaborate thing. Now go back on Veronese's thing. In the center, we have a scene of Christ at the Last Supper. Many important things Christ did at the Last Supper. But this is the last instructions he gives to his disciples. And then all around him is all this beautiful architecture, classical architecture, figures dancing, partying, having a good time, fighting, animals fighting for scraps, everything else. And I think that's the ultimate inspiration. So the inspiration here does come from the North, but it's not necessarily Protestant. It's an inspiration that is meant to say, hey, are you paying attention to the things you should be paying attention to? Wonderful, wonderful stuff. But it shows how all of this tension from the Counter Reformation is built into this, and we will talk more about the Counter Reformation in a bit.